Laura, thank you so much, and thank you for putting it on the agenda. I know that it's hard to get excited about regulation at 8:30 in the morning, but I get a little excited about this because it is indeed a real step change in approaches to regulation, because it takes us away from moderation and content removal-based approaches alone, which has been the large part of the conversation among governments in Europe for many, many, many years. What do we do about these problems? How do we remove the bits of content that are a problem? It takes us beyond that, something that we've very much advocated at ISD with our work, which has computationally analyzed online harms over many years and shown that there are two sets of problems. One is that the platforms are very bad at enforcing their own rules. And I presented a little bit of data on the opening panel that talked a little bit about how, even in the context of violent extremist or hate speech content that isn't permitted on the mainstream platforms by their own statements and commitments, by their own terms of service, the enforcement of their own rules is incredibly shoddy. And that enforcement becomes even patchier, even more problematic in environments which are less scrutinized, i.e. outside of English language speaking environments. Often in environments where those types of activities on mainstream platforms, hateful and conspiratorial and extremist activity online, can lead, in fact, to grave, grave harm offline, as we've seen in many parts of the world. That kind of content is still circulating and reaching, even in the UK context, where we're about to see regulation come into place, millions of people on mainstream platforms. And we analyze the whole ecosystem of platforms from mainstream through to fringe, and of course a lot of that really nasty activity in terms of mobilization to violence happens on fringe platforms, but the mainstream platforms still have massive problems. So in the tens of millions we've seen users reached with this kind of content. That is 100-fold in environments where there's less scrutiny. But the second big problem that we talked about was the problem of the amplification, the inorganic amplification of essentially whatever comes closest to the red line of acceptability on these platforms. And I talked about this as well, but we have so many examples of this. I think it's important just to understand that these platforms, because of the business model, which is really about holding your attention as long as they can, ultimately end up amplifying, recommending, amplifying some of the most harmful content to and targeting that content to the most vulnerable constituencies. And it's that algorithmic challenge, that business model algorithmic challenge, as the products and the algorithms designed essentially to inorganically distort the playing field for speech, that really is a problem. And everybody talks about this, I think, in very binary terms: free speech, censorship. We are not operating in free speech environments on these platforms. These are curated speech environments where these companies get essentially to decide through their products, their services, their algorithmic design, what you see. And that is not a free speech environment. We've advocated, therefore, that we need to go well beyond thinking about removing bits of content to thinking about how we oversee, how we provide transparency and accountability for the systems themselves, the decisions, the products, the algorithms, the systems. And that is where the DSA is a cause for optimism. The DSA, which has come into effect already, it entered into force in 2022, November, obliges now very large online platforms, these are, and very large online search engines, to conduct risk assessments and mitigation measures on their services, including what they call systemic risks related to the dissemination of not just illegal content, and this is what's interesting, dissemination of negative effects of content that may have negative effects on fundamental rights, that may have negative effects on civic discourse and electoral process, on public security, and on gender-based violence or mental health. So this is incredibly comprehensive. This is looking not just at risks to individuals in the way that the Online Safety Bill in the UK does, it's societal risks. And this piece of legislation will require of the platforms to provide API data access to data that we have never, ever, ever had access to, any of us. No government, no regulator, no academic institution, no think tank. None of us have had access to the data that the platforms have to be able to actually see, actually understand the impact of these services. For the first time, they will be required to provide that data access to regulators, to vetted research organizations, not only academic institutions, which is quite amazing, to be able to create an ecosystem of scrutiny, which will go in a number of directions. It will be an ecosystem of scrutiny in relation to what is actually being enforced, what is being removed, but it also means that if people feel that they've been badly treated, that they should not have been removed, that their content was removed without there being real reason for it, they get a chance to seek redress. And so the entire ecosystem, and for that overstretch or overreach to be scrutinized too. And so the entire ecosystem is a transparency ecosystem. And this is the fundamental point. This is not about, ultimately, when authoritarian governments seek to deal with these problems online, they seek to do so through harsh control and censorship. A democratic approach must be centered around sharp transparency, legislated, meaningful transparency. And I will say, having worked with many platforms over the years to try to build countermeasures, counter-speech, educational, fundamentally those activities which are valuable and must happen and should be able to have an impact can't until we level the playing field for speech. And that will not happen, we realized, after years of trying, we're doing this for too long, will not happen through self-regulation. And I think that realization happened in Europe over the last sort of 4 or 5 years in a very fundamental way, and this set of legislative packages that we see at the EU and in the UK are really looking to provide us with transparency and an equaling of the space in which discourse happens today, so that we can, in fact, compete.